Thank you, Tom, very much, and to the Asia Society for its partnership in this project. The dashboard part of our conversation this morning. Very much excited and looking forward to our panel together with Wendy and Shery from Bloomberg to talk about what's happening topically right now between China and the United States and more broadly. Let me kind of set the context here around why this dashboard undertaking that we've done together is so important at a time like this. We have some people are referring to them as the Magnificent Seven, the American team that's in Beijing today and tomorrow, trying to figure out what the realm of the possible is between China and the United States on the economic front. So many things that are non-economic that are right at the middle of the conversation as well, but this team's looking at the economics. Very hard to discern what's the potential, what's the possible in terms of a compromise or a negotiated outcome this week without having a better sense of the big picture. What's the larger, pulling the camera back, what's the forest look like here? And what this project here that I'm going to summarize our latest quarterly update is all about is asking how much of China's own self-assigned reform agenda is underway, being implemented, and moving forward. The question of how much of China's basic macroeconomic reform is being effected, is being successfully put in place, to a large degree, determines how much room there is for negotiating, compromising, coming out together. If China and the United States are basically convergent in terms of the essential aspects of how our economic systems work, if we're both basically going toward a future where the market determines who wins and who loses at the end of the day, except in rare exceptional cases where a clear explanation can be offered as to why the government should come in and pick the winners and losers. If we're convergent in that way, then there's, despite all the fire and brimstone and fire and fury in economic terms that we hear from time to time, there's a lot of potential to move this thing forward down the road, ultimately. If, on the other hand, we're not convergent and that in important ways China is deciding to go in a different direction, even against where it had intended to go, then there probably is much more of a limit, a governor, if you will, on how much our diagrams can overlap at the end of the day. That's what this research exercise is all about, trying to, as objectively as possible, offer some transparency into where those big picture reform elements are in the China story. This is where we came out this morning and what was released. We have 10 dimensions that we distilled from Xi Jinping's initial economic plan that he put on the table at the start of his era in 2013. Those 10 elements you can see are labeled on the little rectangles there, from innovation at the top to labor on the bottom. The ghost in gray, we call that ghosting when you do that in a visual, tells you where we were last quarter when we updated this 3 months ago versus where we are today. So it gives you a sense of the movement in which direction. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we have what we're generally calling progress, moving toward achievement of the goals that Beijing set for itself, and being in the left, the west side of the chart from where you're sitting right now, indicates that we're not moving ahead in the direction that China itself determined it needed to go. As you can see, overwhelmingly, China's not where it wants to be, needs to be right now. Fully 8 out of 10 are either in neutral or in negative position relative to where Beijing thought it needed to be, and 2 elements only moving forward. In the dashboard online, you'll find a tremendously rich tool to work through the analytics with data available. A primary indicator that we think, if you only have time to look at one indication of how things are going, look at this one. But then each of these clusters, each of these 10 in our online dashboard website, have supplemental indicators that enrich that story and offer a little bit more color on the aspects. In the texts that accommodate each of the reform clusters we look at, after we are very disciplined and say we're only going to look at the outcome data, in the first part of our discussion of each of these, We're not going to listen to any of the promises or pledges. They don't get any credit until they actually move the needle in the right direction. But then in the second half of each of our analyses, we do look at what was most recently said about what's going to happen next in order to see whether there's reason to be cheerful and hopeful about things, where things are going in the near future. I'm not going to spend, because I don't have enough time on each and every one of the 10, but let me just run you real quick through a couple of them anyway, and then we can always circle back later if we need to and use some of these metrics to support some of the conversation we'll have in about 5 minutes. On the positive side, we have two items, as I said: innovation, of all things, and environment policy reform. In both of those cases, in 2013, China had said, if we don't make our economy more innovative as we become a higher income economy, we're not going to be able to keep growth up. We're not going to succeed here. That's going to be a middle income trap that we can't get out of. Also, everyone recognizes if we don't turn around environmental deterioration, then the whole thing is for naught, because it's becoming more and more unlivable to be in China today. So on the innovation front, this, I think, points to how sort of even-handed we try to be in defining what success is, not by in Western terms, not in American terms, but using China's own definition of what the goal is. China's own definition is more of the Chinese economy needs to be innovative than not innovative relative to the past, when all China was doing was making socks and underwear for export and growing grain and rice. So our yellow line for China here is a measure of, if you look at China's Made in China 2025 industries, the sort of sunrise industries of the future, what is the share of those industries in overall industrial output? Sure enough, it's going up in a very strong, pronounced manner. We see that trend line going back the whole 5 years. Each of our analytics has a 5-year framework that we use to look at what the trend line is. And there, for reference, we put in U.S., EU, and Japanese for comparison. What is the weight of those same industries in our economies as a benchmark to compare against? China is getting very close to reaching the U.S. level. Now, where the footnote, the asterisk on the home run number for China innovation is, that says nothing about how China is getting there. And as you will be aware if you've been alive the past 3 or 4 months, there are some rather strong statements coming out of OECD economies, advanced economies, that the way China is managing to become more innovative is unfair and unacceptable in terms of pressure on foreign companies to transfer technology and things like that. So just because they're getting their numbers in the right place by their definition doesn't mean that that's going to be sustainable either. But we do have to credit that by their definition, they're kind of getting where they need to go in terms of innovation right now. Likewise, on environment, it is quite extraordinary how seriously China is implementing environmental policy controls right now. Wendy and I were down in D.C. at a conference the past 2 days at which a very senior German executive with a German petrochemical company was saying, congratulations to Beijing for having blue skies. All it took was cutting off natural gas, industrial natural gas supplies to his business in Chongqing so that his billion-dollar new plant was sitting idle, losing money for the past 3 or 4 months. Because to keep the skies blue, they had to take all that gas and use it to replace coal that was being burned in North China to keep people warm this past winter, right? So these unintended consequences of environmental reform are quite real. They're going to be a drag on industry that will be an interesting point for conversation for us. And you'll find some of that discussion online in the dashboard website. So moving on from that, I'll just speak to maybe one or two of the elements that are on the negative side, this one and maybe one other. This is our primary, if you only have time to look at one thing, and all this is public and online, you'll find it, so you don't have to photograph it all, to those of you snapping pics. One of perhaps the most critical question for whether China is modernizing, upgrading the way its system works, whether it really has a model which is ready to rival Western models of economic organization is the financial system efficient, or is most of China's growth just coming from building up bad debt today? Anybody can build up bad debt And anybody the size of China can build it up for a long time. But you can't do it forever. And it's not an indication of productivity and sustainability. If it's all debt-based, then you're borrowing from tomorrow to pay for today. You're eating the seed corn, another American Chengyu metaphor we use to describe that. So the blue line there is the ratio of how much, in simple terms, how much capital needs to get put to work to get 1 unit of growth in the economy. In a healthy system, IMF would say it's probably about 3.5 or 4 to 1. $3.5 put to work today. A couple quarters from now, you'll see U.S. growth, demand growth, sustainable, rise by 1. So 3.5 to 1. China today, it's around 7. And it's flattened out at that incredibly high level, but it's not really coming down yet, despite the ardent effort at deleveraging that we discuss and truly is going on in China today. But there's such a large debt and financial system problem that it's really going to take even more draconian measures to get this ratio of capital expense to growth in the economy, if you follow me in this wonky discussion a little bit here, back down to sort of a reasonable level. And that's really quite concerning. It says that the most important reform work of dealing with the way the financial system works, so that it's not just subsidizing things that are never going to pay off or a contingent on the world accepting overcapacity from China in a way which is no longer can be counted on, I think is the message for this week, which we'll probably get into. Shery's probably going to take us there in discussion very quickly. So you get a sense of where we're going with this. Trying in each case to do this using Chinese data and Chinese goals rather than us imposing some Western construct on what we think should be happening. I'll skip right through. I should probably mention trade, otherwise Wendy will scold me afterwards. We build an index looking not at all Chinese imports, but those things which in 2013 China still had a very high level of trade protection on and were not strategically important to the country. So we're not talking about, import-export of munitions here. We're talking about rather, run-of-the-mill, benign kinds of products, which were nonetheless still highly protected, sort of like sugar is in the United States. We still have ridiculously wasteful trade protection around our sugar growers down in Florida. Some of you may be aware. Well, China has its Everglades sugar growers too, so to speak. Lots of them. But the point of the slide is that we can use an index to see whether on the whole over those 5 years, are they ratcheting down those protections on these non-strategic product areas, and they're not really. We see that very much neutral. Actually, the dotted line tells us we're actually a little less well off in that regard than we were 5 years ago even. So neutral to slightly negative there. Moving to the last slide I think I want to talk to just for one of time, let me mention that we also look at labor market reform. Here in New York, we don't often talk about things like land reform in China and labor market reform because we're New Yorkers and we don't much worry about those things relative to financial sector reform and whatnot. But for a country like China, most populous country on the planet, hundreds of millions of people still needing to join the modern economy, labor market reform is really important. I want you to look at the orange line. That's migrant workers in China. There's hundreds of millions of them that make the place tick. As the Hamilton line goes, immigrants, we get the job done. Well, in China, the immigrants are internal immigrants, right, from poor provinces coming into the cities around the country. And up until about 2 years ago, the orange line tells us that their annual wage growth, from like $1 an hour, it was going up faster than GDP growth was going up. So they were slowly, but inexorably catching up to their wealthier cousins in town. For the past 2 years, their wage growth has fallen radically, in fact. This is what makes many private economists think that there's actually some kind of slowdown taking place in China that's not being reflected in the official data well enough. Why all of a sudden are these less empowered workers seeing their wage growth at 30% below reported GDP growth levels, right? So that says to us they're not getting the job that they want to get done in labor market reform either. Interestingly, just this morning on my way in, I saw some hopeful signs from yesterday's State Council meeting in Beijing that new labor market reforms are being designed to specifically address this problem of internal migration in China, so that people can move to where the best jobs can be found for them there, which, as you'll discover if you dig into the text online, is some of where we go in terms of prospective potential to get things moving in the right direction. Let me stop there, and I'm super excited about the panel discussion that we're about to have, and also to any feedback I might get from anybody in the room and online to what we've done with the latest edition of Dashboard. Nick Constaneri, my colleague here at the front table, is overseeing our quarter-by-quarter massive effort to stand this up in a way which will meet the test of scrutiny by folks in China, the U.S., and elsewhere. And you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was great. I appreciate, as I said earlier, your gift for clarity and weaving in things as disparate as eating seed corn in China and Hamilton references. It's great. And in addition to Dan's team at Rhodium, all of this content is at asiasociety.org, and if you would like even more than that to be in touch with our policy team, please do. Joining Dan on the stage now, to his right directly, is our own Wendy Cutler, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Managing Director of our Washington office. And as you probably know, Wendy served for many years as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, most recently Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, and lead negotiator, and you could say architect, of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that I mentioned earlier. And I can tell you that she is highly sought after for comment and analysis always, but particularly in these heady days on these issues for all the goings-on regarding global trade issues, Asia in particular. So delighted, Wendy, that you've come up from Washington today. Among those who come to Wendy for comment, the team at Bloomberg News, and to Wendy's right is today's moderator from Bloomberg, Shery Ahn. She serves as co-anchor both for the Bloomberg Markets Show and Bloomberg Markets Balance of Power. And at the Asia Society, I'll just add this, I don't think this is in the bio you have around here. I'm not going to embarrass you, Shery, but we have a lot of colleagues here with interesting and truly global backgrounds. I'll just share this about Shery. She was raised in Bolivia, was an anchor for NHK Television, NHK World in Tokyo, and a diplomatic correspondent for Arirang TV in Seoul. And so, in addition to English, Shery speaks Spanish, Korean, and Japanese. So, welcome to you all. Shery, stick to English for this one.
Thank you, Tom. That wasn't embarrassing at all. But I'm so excited to be here because I've been speaking to Wendy for the past few months remotely, and she's always in D.C., so I see her on camera. It's like, Wendy, hi! But today we met in person, so I'm very excited to be here. And also, Dan, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to be using it as background on Bloomberg, and I'll be coming to you for more details on that. So today, the topic is averting a China-U.S. trade war. And I have to say, I've been covering this every single day for the past few months, or ever since President Trump came to office. But I'm confused a little bit as well, because there's so much happening. It started with still on the aluminum tariffs. Well, it started with rhetoric, then it started with tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, then revision of tariffs. I'm confused. So let's start with Wendy, who can walk us through what's been happening so far and where we are right now in this tit-for-tat action between the U.S. and China.
Okay, well, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to provide kind of what I call the scorecard. Dan provided information on the China economic dashboard. Now we're going to do the China scorecard. And actually, it started before steel and aluminum, but no one seems to remember solar and washing machines. That happened in January. Vis-a-vis China, though, the imposition of tariffs on imports of solar panels was kind of the first shot in the bow, I would say, in this increasing trade friction between the U.S. and China. These tariffs were imposed under Section 201 of the U.S. trade law. It's called a safeguard action, which safeguard actions are recognized under international trading rules as legitimate. However, certain countries, including China, believed that the United States did not follow the WTO rules in imposing those tariffs. So China is suing the United States in the WTO about our application of those tariffs. In addition, China, soon after we announced imposition of tariffs on solar, they announced an anti-dumping investigation into U.S. imports of sorghum used as feed for animals. And they proceeded with this investigation, and just a few weeks ago announced tariffs of about 187% on U.S. imports of sorghum. So that's number one. Number two, we have the steel and aluminum tariffs that have been imposed against China and other countries. Certain countries recently, earlier this week, were given a permanent exemption from steel and aluminum tariffs, including Korea. Others were given another month to negotiate perhaps non-imposition of the tariffs, including the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. However, vis-a-vis China, we have imposed a 25% against Chinese imports of steel, 10% tariff against imports of aluminum. And China has already responded there, and they have imposed corresponding retaliation in the amount of about $3 billion, hitting a range of U.S. products, including wine and pork. And then probably the most significant action that is still pending, but we are moving rapidly towards potential action, is action under Section 301 of our trade law. And this is a result of an investigation that the United States undertook looking at China's practices on intellectual property and on forced technology transfer. They concluded that China has pursued unfair trade practices and announced a series of measures, including the administration's plan to impose tariffs valued at $50 billion worth of Chinese imports, largely in the sectors that were targeted under in the high technology area. China quickly responded there and came up with their $50 billion list, saying if the U.S. goes ahead and actually imposes these tariffs on $50 billion worth of imports, China would do the same. But guess what? China's list is a lot different than our list in terms of the products they've picked, and they picked a lot of agriculture products and other products that would hurt certain U.S. companies and affect certain districts with significant political importance in the United States, including products like soybeans, planes, cars, etc. If that wasn't enough, President Trump said, well, this isn't okay. I'm going to direct my team now to come up with another list of $100 billion worth of potential tariffs against China. My understanding is that list is being worked on. And in addition, he has asked the Treasury Department to come up with a list of investment restrictions that we could potentially put in place against Chinese investment in the United States, largely to mirror the practices that China is employing to restrict U.S. investment in China. So I'm going to stop there.
Yes.
I'm sure I cleared that all up.
So that took a while. Dan, you mentioned the lack of reforms in China. I mean, all of these actions that Wendy mentioned must be also a response in frustration for the lack of reforms in China. When I saw your presentation, my question was, is the lack of reform there a consequence of China's lack of trying, or is it because they've tried but they face challenges, especially in the last few years with the financial meltdown, with the capital flights and so on?
I love that question. That is a terrific question. And I'm glad somebody's still asking it, because there's a little bit of a tendency right now for most folks on the U.S. side to say, well, we must have just been completely naive in the past. China never really intended to reform. This was all just a trick, hide and bide. We got fooled. It seems the president almost uses those words to talk about where things stand. And yet, if you look back even at the Xi era since 2013, first, this kind of a little bit shocking set of things that I just said, these were China's goals, and this is where China is on its own goals. Those really are China's goals, right? 2013 vintage objectives that were set out, which Xi himself said, if we don't achieve these, we will find ourselves in a dead end. We and the party, he mentioned, is part of the we he was talking about, will really find ourselves, lost and in trouble and in a in a blind alley that we can't get out of, right? So, one, they put a plan on the table that was dead serious, which is what got us started. Tom goes back here, and Deborah, to our early effort to deal with this, how to interpret this extraordinary thing. And then over the past 5 years, we had an attempt to truly open up the equity markets, right, which was very exciting for a moment and then turned into an equity market meltdown and all sorts of the repercussions of that. We had a completely sincere, real effort to reduce barriers on the capital account and let Chinese global investment take off. And that certainly worked, right? And my colleagues at Rhodium and I do a ton of work on the direct investment footprint of China, not just in the U.S., but all over the world. That worked, but it also created this incredible concern about balance of payments problems. After all, $1 trillion of China's foreign exchange went away in 18 months that had taken 20 years to build up the first trillion, right, in that country. And then we have other, the deleveraging campaign, and whether they're taking their foot off the brakes right now for fear that growth is falling too fast. So actually, I would say it's not that they don't believe they have to get a reform agenda done. It's that it turns out it's really hard to do. And that it's particularly hard to do if you don't have market mechanisms, but it's all on the party whether it succeeds or not. And right now, there's really little appetite to say the party got this one wrong and that one right. Everything is Xi's responsibility because she has taken charge of every single body that has any responsibility for decision making right now. It's not on the markets if it doesn't work. It's on him. That sets a kind of difficult political economy environment in which to get some of these things corrected for.
And yet, Wendy, as Dan's dashboard showed, the one of the two areas where China is making progress is innovation. How does that play into U.S. concerns of what it might view China as infringing on IP and technology theft, and then getting ahead on that area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it just underscores the current concerns of the administration, that the one area where they seem to be reforming and seem to be succeeding is moving up that value chain. And the concern is how they're getting there. And the administration is alleging they're getting there through unfair trade practices, through forcing our companies, for example, when they invest in China, to turn over their technology, turn over their IPR, turn over their source codes to their joint venture partners. And so the administration is focused particularly on this sector. And in reading China's Made in China 2025 plan, where in black and white, China lays out a plan for global dominance in 10 sectors in advanced technology, it just underscores these concerns. And so these are the issues that are going to be on the table and probably are on the table right now in Beijing in meetings between senior level officials from both sides.
Great thing that you took us there, because we have to talk about this huge U.S. delegation going to China, starting these talks. And as if by magic, just yesterday, just ahead of the U.S. delegation arriving in China, a senior Chinese official just had the time to talk to a few members of the press, including Bloomberg, saying that they will not give up on, or they will not give in to core demands that the U.S. is making, including that reduction of the trade deficit by $100 billion, and also that it won't accept any preconditions as abandoning their long-time manufacturing ambitions, the 2025 Made in China policy. So given this environment, Wendy, what are your expectations for this meeting?
So one thing I've learned is always keep your expectations really low.
Coming from a former trade negotiator, yes.
Because these issues are really tough. The fact that so many people are being sent from this administration to this meeting, I think underscores not only the importance the administration attaches to this issue, but to be frank, I think there are different views among administration officials of how hardline they should be or which issues should really be the priority issues and whether we can actually find a negotiated solution. So I suspect that there are going to be frank discussions. There'll be a lot of kind of formal back and forth with not sufficient conversation. But I view this meeting as the first in a series of meetings, and I think important markers can be put down. The one advice I've been asked, like, what would you suggest that the administration officials should do? My view is not only should they put down markers and really kind of insights into their priorities, but also I think it's really important for them to listen very closely. Because as someone who's worked a lot with different countries in the negotiating room for many, many years, listening is very important. And sometimes openings are provided if you listen very carefully to the words used. And for example, is China saying that they won't dismantle the Made in China 2025 policy? That's one thing. Or are they saying they'll make no changes or will not entertain U.S. requests to ensure that program does not distort international trade and hurt U.S. competition in these sectors? So I am an optimist. I think that if people, that this will be the first of many meetings, but I think a negotiated solution, it'll be very, very difficult. I think it can be found, but I think it's going to take time. And it's not just going to be based on commitments made by China and the U.S. saying thank you very much and walking away from the table. I think we're going to have to see many months and years of ensuring that these commitments are lived up to and adhered to.
How valid are the U.S. concerns over China's IP and trade practices, Dan?
Oh, they're valid enough, right? I think anybody who's been working in this space for a long while has wrestled at times with the difficulty of quantifying it, of putting a sharp, bright set of metrics around the nature of the problem. It is a complicated one. Foreign firms often tripped over one another to put more technology on the table to try to box out their rivals for a privileged position in the Chinese economy. But I'm comfortable saying that it was a singular objective of Chinese policy design to create an environment which would make that would apply pressure to foreign firms and hold back the ability to compete in participate in the Chinese economy as a function of how much technology they were willing to bring in. I mean, look no further than the joint venture requirements in the country. In the vast bulk of industries, you can't even own your own business. It has to have a Chinese partner, and the Chinese partner will, in most cases, insist that you set up an R&D institute alongside your commercial business where you're training local academics, students, and people in how you do what you do for a living. So in some sense, it's very, very difficult to have a purely fact-based discussion about just how much culpability there is on the Chinese side here. But, in my view, there's an abundance of evidence that there are still now antiquated elements to how the Chinese system works with regard to foreign control over their own assets like technology, that it's time to move beyond this. Not just in a piecemeal fashion by saying, okay, the auto sector. We'll open up the auto sector to 100% foreign ownership. I need an airtight excuse for why any industry like amusement parks still needs to have a Chinese partner in it. What's so strategic about Disneyland that Disney can't own its own business?
Given that background, Wendy, you've said that this whole negotiation will take time, but we're coming against a hard deadline. The public comment period on the first $50 billion of U.S. tariffs are running out in a couple of weeks. So what happens if there's no breakthrough in this negotiation?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, and as you mentioned, this $50 billion of tariff increases that has been announced is subject to public comment now. Public comments are due, I believe it's next week, and a public hearing will be held on March 15th. May 15th with the deadline of May 22nd for comments. But then it's not like the U.S. under law is required within 3 days then to impose the tariffs. I think they're going to spend some time, and they'll need to spend time really looking at the comments that have been received. Because while I think that the administration team has tried very hard to come up with a tariff list that will hurt China more than the United States, I think a number of these comments will reveal that U.S. businesses with U.S. workers will be affected by some of these tariff increases, factories that rely on Chinese inputs, factories that rely on Chinese machinery. And so I think there will be adjustments in this list. Also, even after once the adjustments are made, the administration has time they can delay imposition of tariffs. They can say, we are in negotiations, we're going to suspend this investigation. So the tariffs are on the horizon, and it will be, the administration is going to have to make the call about if and whether they should actually impose these tariffs. And I suspect a lot of that call will be based on what they hear in Beijing this week.
You've talked about the Chinese retaliatory tariffs being on political pressure points for here in the United States, soybeans, pork, the ag sector that affects a lot of President Trump's base. But at the same time, given that some say that China will lose a trade war, given that they export more to the U.S., how true is that?
Yeah, I mean, people look at this very simply. Since they sell a lot more to us, they're going to be a lot more vulnerable in a trade war. And my view is just the opposite. I think that China could survive and has much more wherewithal to live through a trade war than the United States. And a lot of this just has to do with the way that their society is structured. I think in the U.S., and we're already seeing this, where senators and congressmen are already coming into the administration along with stakeholders saying, end this. The U.S. farm community couldn't be more vocal that they do not want to be in the crosshairs of a potential trade war, and they would like a negotiated settlement. And so I think there'll be a lot of pressure put on the administration to find a negotiated solution once either these tariffs look imminent or they're actually imposed. And what I'm also hearing, particularly in the agricultural community, is, planting season is coming up. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in the market. So the threat of tariff increases is already having an effect on U.S. decisions, not only in agriculture, but also on the business side as well. And people are starting to have to figure out, if we have to pay 25% more for such and such inputs, can we look to other countries? What are we going to do? How are we going to diversify? Or do we just pay the tariff? And so even the threat of tariffs is creating kind of an uncertainty in the U.S. economy.
Dan?
I mean, I think Wendy is making absolutely the right point, that nobody who tells you they can be confident about who wins and loses and what the magnitude of the losses would be is telling you the truth. Nobody really knows. You'd be better trying to predict the weather a month from now, today in New York, than trying to guess what the economics are going to look like at the end of the day. When it comes to U.S. soybean exports or sorghum, for example, if China chooses to go to Canadian supply instead of U.S., then that takes Canadian soybeans off the international market. Who fills that unfilled order from Canada? The United States does, right? So it's extremely difficult and complex to game all this through. But we do know, because we modeled it a lot over the years, that globalizing international trade had this terrifically good effect on consumers everywhere, right? Consumer buying power, stretching that consumer dollar from Kentucky to Kyoto was a global reality. If we put this thing in reverse and go beyond just this tit-for-tat brinksmanship to really starting to disassemble the kind of production chains that we've built over the past 3 decades, it's going to impose a general inflationary drag on all of us, for sure. That's about as far as we can go empirically.
What we do know, though, is that the political systems in China and the U.S. are different, right? So we were talking about President Xi Jinping consolidating his power in China, and yet here in the U.S., we're in a democracy with many different stakeholders. Wendy, is that going to affect who can endure a trade war longer?
Oh, I think so. And I think if you read the Chinese press, I mean, China's beginning to get, the message out from up top that, we are being unfairly pointed to on these practices, and we can, if this means that the U.S. is going to put up tariffs against us, we can live through this. And so I think the different political systems will really contribute to China being able to last longer in such a trade war. But I don't want to underestimate, there are a lot of costs for China as well. And I mean, the key point is no one wins in this tariff tit for tat. And both sides have a lot to lose: consumers, workers, companies. And so, once again, I think it's important that both sides are beginning to talk, because a negotiated solution, to me, is the best route forward.
Okay, so a negotiated solution, but at the same time, we're talking about tariffs and a trade war not being good in trying to change China's behavior. What about investment curbs?
Maybe I'll let Dan start. Look at his eyebrows.
Look, the U.S. has, we're not talking about changes to U.S. trade and investment policy between the United States and North Korea, because we have no trade and investment. Part of what we're dealing with here is that China and the United States are deeply, deeply partnered together as economic partners. There's a lot that knits us together. Just as for the United States and Canada, we've had more trade disputes with Canada over the past 50 years than anybody else. Doesn't mean that we've got a problem with Canada. It means we trade a lot. So some of the trade and a lot of the investment tensions we're having right now are a result of, we didn't ever used to have any Chinese investment in America, and now we do. And it's happening at a time when the nature of vulnerability around different technologies is changing quickly. The Germans are unsure about American investment in Germany. So not surprising, we're, for the first time in more than a decade now, looking at our investment screening regimes and asking, in light of technology, in light of China, in light of all these things, does this need changing and upgrading? The answer to that is yes, it does. And every nation, including China, is going through that same stock-taking process of asking, how do I take the security anxieties off the table so that I can let business people do what business people need to do? On top of that, unfortunately, this White House is politicizing the imposition of new investment restrictions, and that showed up in the 301 executive order as one of three elements that was put on the table. So far, the president has stayed his hand. His Treasury Department has stayed its hand. If Secretary Mnuchin does not come back from Beijing with a clear answer to what he negotiated and succeeded in getting from Beijing on the investment front, he's going to have to answer the question, what is Washington's new investment restriction under the 301 executive order? So, we have to be careful about what we threaten to do, because we have to follow up on it when we do it. And there are some things that could happen on the investment side which might not be so useful really in the longer run, but which could happen now. But important to separate these sort of momentary political instincts that maybe we could use that for leverage from the larger reform, for example, of the CFIUS process that you hear about, which by and large is a reasonable thing for the United States to be doing at this point in time.
But if I could just add another dimension here, and that is really with my trade hat on. Increasing tariffs violates the World Trade Organization, our obligations under the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And as a result, by announcing that we are going to increase tariffs against China under Section 301, this is helping to make it really uncomfortable for other countries who are like-minded, who share our concerns vis-a-vis China, but don't like the fact that the U.S. is willing to violate its WTO obligations and act alone. And so if I were given the choice, or if I was asked which measure to do or which measure to go with first as possible leverage, I would lean towards investment restrictions, because I think that would allow us to build an international coalition, or at least work with like-minded countries, because I think in the long run we'll be a lot more successful in terms of trying to urge China to open and to reform if we're working with other countries. And on top of it, since I still have the floor, with respect to these steel and aluminum tariffs, where basically we are increasing tariffs against our allies and friends at a time when we want their help on China, is really kind of a strange sequencing of actions. And when I talk to countries like Japan or like the EU, and even countries in Southeast Asia, they're really puzzled by how they could be asked to work enthusiastically with the United States on the China problem when we are hitting them with steel and aluminum tariffs. And by the way, China, at least on steel, is our number 10 source of steel right now. And so by definition, under this 232 action on steel imports, we are hurting our allies who ship a lot more steel to us than China does.
Let me read you a tweet from President Trump last month. China, which is a great economic power, is considered a developing nation within the World Trade Organization. They therefore get tremendous perks and advantages, especially over the U.S. Does anybody think this is fair? We were badly represented. The WTO is unfair to the United States. How much of the administration's actions are against China, and how much are they against just the liberal international economic order, Wendy?
I think it's a combination of both because, look, the administration has a valid point that a lot of the trade rules in the WTO don't reflect and don't address the challenges we're facing with China. And frankly, they don't reflect challenges we're facing with other countries as well. The WTO has not been able to negotiate a comprehensive new rules in areas now for over 20 years, and so we're kind of stuck with the old rules. And so there is validity to the administration's point. That said, to just go ahead and to say we are going to break our own obligations to the WTO, particularly when we have other means to address the China problem, to me, once again, seems to be, something. It seems to be an action that is not warranted. I would also just add that at the same time, the U.S. Is raising questions with respect to other aspects of the WTO, particularly its dispute settlement process, which is leading many in the WTO to think that we are not interested in working within the WTO system anymore, but we are ready to kind of turn unilaterally and do what we need to do, regardless of the international obligations we've undertaken.
And it's quite challenging for the WTO as well, because I believe in their history, they have never seen this trade disputes on a national security basis when they connect economic affairs with national security, as is the case for the Section 232 of steel and aluminum. So, Dan, how did this relationship change between the U.S. and China when all of a sudden they're now strategic competitors? And does it complicate the problem in trying to solve this?
It is the problem, I think, right? It is the problem itself. You put your finger on it. And as I've tried a couple times here this morning, it's complicated, but I think we have to separate out sort of the deep structural story from the short-term narrative that is affecting how we see these issues. The deep structural reality is that China has been becoming wealthier, more sophisticated, more able, based on its own indigenous capabilities, to do higher tech things for 40 years. And its interests outside its own borders have been expanding as well. For the first time in 3,000 years, China is dependent on fossil fuels coming from the other end of the planet, from unstable places through potentially unstable waters. This was never a Chinese problem until about 15 years ago in its history. There's no precedent for China having to worry about things so far from home. So this is new, and it naturally brings about these questions of geopolitical overlap of interests and potential conflict. On top of that, we have the multi-decade question of whether China's system economic system was slowly but consistently evolving to be more like the systems we use in the advanced economies out here. It was pretty safe to say when Zhu undertook the negotiations necessary to get China into the WTO and make the commitments that China made to enter the WTO, that he imagined a future China that had a much smaller role, for example, for state enterprises, a much smaller role for the Communist Party of China in guiding and deciding how outcomes were going to occur in industry after industry after industry, compared to what Xi Jinping is saying today. So these are the really long-standing arc of history questions which we have to grapple with and wrestle with. And as we discussed before, there has been some change of the debate in Beijing about what's the best model to look after China's long-term economic welfare and what kind of political evolution China would need in order to have a more OECD-like economic system. It turns out very hard to have our economy with their politics. No one's ever done it. China has done so much that surprised us in past decades that we kind of gave it the benefit of the doubt. Maybe China could have an authoritarian politics and a more or less liberal economics. That is not looking very likely to most people right now. And on top of that, even in just the past few months, many Chinese on the economic side have started explicitly saying China's model is different than the Western model. They had previously always, whenever anybody said Beijing consensus, Beijing model, everyone on the Chinese side pointed out, that's Josh Ramo. That's not anybody in China saying that China has a model, an alternative economic model. Now they are saying that they do. And that has, in turn, made it more difficult for traditional engagers, liberals in the US and Europe to say, hey, we're convergent. We're going to get to the same place. We just have to manage patience, maybe deal with the symptoms of trade problems for the time being, but we don't have to really contemplate blowing up the system as we know it. And now all of that's open for debate and discussion.
Wendy?
Sorry.
Yeah, but I would just add, though, that this rules-based economy has served the U.S. well. Is it perfect? No. Are we better off with a rules-based system where countries can be held to the rules? Yes. Did we get it right with China in the WTO? In hindsight, you can say no, but did it make perfect sense at the time to let China into the WTO? Absolutely. And so, these are the issues. You can't predict the future. I think there were two things. There were two expectations in 2001 when China joined. One was, as Dan mentioned, I think there was a sense that China was on kind of on a trajectory towards reform and opening. It was unstoppable, and that the WTO would help, that China's working with other countries in the WTO would help accelerate that trend. And second, the other expectation, once again, was that the WTO would keep negotiating updated rules. And that just didn't happen. The Doha round was launched right when China joined the WTO. And, well, I think from the U.S. perspective, the Doha round is dead. Other people say it's on life support. It's never reached a successful conclusion. And the WTO has experienced, I think, two successful, very specific negotiating outcomes over the past 20 years, but they haven't updated the rules. They don't deal. There are no rules in state-owned enterprises, for example, in the WTO. There are no updated rules on digital trade, on the internet, et cetera. And so, that's kind of what we're left with.
Let me just amplify the importance of what Wendy's saying. The most critical thing for the U.S. right when I either look at short term, like the negotiations this week, or the longer term question of what the Trump era strategy is that we do not abandon our own principles that got us to the success that we enjoy in this country. Rule of law and the fidelity to the liberal principles that have worked so well for us are first and foremost what I'm talking about when I say that. We are showing some temptation in some circles right now to maybe do it the Chinese way, because it seems to be working pretty well for them. Whether it's some elements of industrial policy, nationalizing telecommunications in this country, for example, are respectable parts of discussion in Washington today, which I still find shocking, given the assumptions I've worked with most of my career. And one among many reasons why we need to stick to doing it our way is that I still do believe that this detour toward statism back in the statist direction that I perceive in China, we see in the dashboard, is temporary. It's not going to be China's tendency for the very long term, because it's not going to work. It's not going to pay the bills. That's what I have the luxury of thinking, 5, 10 years down the road. Policymakers and strategists in government presently don't have that luxury, of course. But I would offer that up for your consideration.
We have seen China's overtures in the last few weeks, whether it's in the financial sector, greater access to global investment banks, or, as you said, the full ownership of the full foreign ownership in the car industry. But at the same time, those are piecemeal solutions.
Piecemeal, yeah. And we're past, piecemeal is for developing countries. So when President Trump made the remark you quoted about China's mindset that it has a developing countries obligations in WTO, one of the elements of that is that things can be done in a gradualist, piecemeal way, that we should be graded based on whether we put one new industry on the table. That's one better than yesterday. Shouldn't you be happy that we're moving in the right direction? But piecemeal doesn't do it when you get to be a $13 trillion economy.
I think some of these announcements or some of these commitments could be part of an ultimate deal, but I don't think they can be the core of this deal. I don't think it's worth bringing the United States on the brink of a trade war to have an outcome that just has selective opening in certain sectors.
We have a very diverse group of people going to China right now.
Nice way to put it.
Free traders and some that we have called protectionists. What should or can the U.S. compromise on in this environment, Wendy?
Well, let's just back up for a minute. Initially this delegation was going to be 4 people, and now it's 7. And so additional members of the economic team now have gotten on the delegation. And that's important, number one, if you want to be viewed as a player on these China decisions. You want to go to Beijing and be part of this discussion. You want to be seen by the Chinese to be at the table. And when the discussions move back to Washington in the Oval Office, you want to be in the Oval Office and be able to say you were there in Beijing. But I think what it also suggests is that there's just not a unified position among the administration on these issues. I think overall they share the same concerns, but I think there are differences of views in terms of whether what a negotiated solution should look like, or even whether there should be a negotiated solution. And so I would hope that this team on the airplane and in their private meetings leading up to these meetings really displays a unified front for the Chinese, having negotiated with a lot of countries, and not just China. Other countries, they can sense the minute there's any division in a delegation, particularly at senior levels, and they will try and exploit these differences.
So what would you do if you were in that delegation?
What I would do is make sure that it's not a free-for-all in terms of what everyone is saying at the table, that it's very unified and people are given a specific issue to discuss, but everyone is kind of under the same rubric of discussion. And that's very hard to do, particularly when you have very senior level people with the kind of backgrounds and business backgrounds of this administration.
Yeah.
Any advice that you would give to the delegation?
Turn the plane around. No, seriously. I mean, I think if it were only Mnuchin going over, that would tell us something. If it were only Navarro going over, that would definitely tell us something too. Having everybody in the mix, we can't really be sure what this is about, what this is for. And I think Wendy's absolutely right. The most important thing is not just to further display all the fractures and differences within this team of rivals or this administration. But I'm curious what the audience thinks about all
Right.
this too.
That's great timing to get to our Q&A.
I'm curious to know, of the players, is there an adult in the room? Because some might think there haven't been in other areas of this administration, not that I'm saying that, but is there an adult in the room who has the gravitas to corral this group of people? Does that person have experience and know what they're doing? And the second part of the question would be the optimistic side of myself. Is there some way that China and the United States on some level is hoping to find some consensus that both people can come out looking like a winner?
So, Beth, with respect to your second question, you know, I'm in your camp, and as someone who's negotiated some intractable differences between governments in this space, I think a negotiated outcome is possible. I think it's going to be difficult, and I think it will take time. And one thing, this administration seems to be impatient a lot. They want results. They want them quickly. That's what the president wants. And I think now we're kind of at a moment in time with China where, you know, this is the first time we've really threatened trade actions along these lines. So I would just hope that people would really, you know, use this opportunity and put a lot of thought into what a negotiated solution should look like, not just what the U.S. wants and what it requests, but also what's in the realm of possibility. What might China be able to do? How might we be able to square the circle? Because I think if you don't take the other country's concerns and red lines into mind, you get into kind of lecturing each side, and you'll end up in an impasse. With respect to your first question, I would answer it a different way, and that is, who has the president's ear on these issues? It's not entirely clear now, but up until now, the past few months, it seems that Ambassador Lighthizer from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative has the president's ear on China trade policy, and he's taking a very hard line. And so we'll have to see how this meeting shakes out. And it's not just the meeting in Beijing, but I think it's when they come back and they're in the Oval Office and they really decide on, do we go ahead with the tariffs? Do we welcome a Chinese delegation back to the United States to continue these discussions? I think we'll see some signs of what the next steps are when they return.
Dan?
They didn't send an advance team, which you need to do if you're going to have a real negotiation. And I don't think a single one of the 7 has ever actually managed a negotiation with Chinese government. Lighthizer's got experience with the Japanese, of course. But to my
How would you
knowledge,
say it's different?
the Chinese negotiating style is distinctive. Many tomes and books have been written by the RAND Corporation and many others describing the particular nuances, tactical approaches. Every country is different. This is a negotiator here. And some things are universal. People can sense divisions, bureaucratic divisions, when there's more than one lead negotiator at the table. And it's not clear who's really leading this delegation. The president referred to it as Mnuchin's trip at first, but that parlance has now fallen away, and it's definitely not just his trip. Anyway, so just some of the signifiers of a good negotiating strategy I haven't seen them presently.
Any more questions?
Many economists think with the budget deficit very much likely to get bigger over the next few years, the trade deficit will also get bigger. How might that affect these negotiations? And might the Chinese have a view that we should try to do something soon because it's only going to get worse? Or what might it mean for the American position a year plus from now when whatever they come up with negotiations, trade deficit numbers still get worse?
I don't think that the medium-term macroeconomic fundamentals are informing negotiating postures on either side right now. I think things are being driven by a much more instinctual sense of the strategic play of matters. And those economists who would ordinarily be coming in and briefing the team on what's the long-term, structure of where things are going aren't even getting close to having a chance to do that briefing, would be my guess.
Yeah, I would just add, though, that since the administration has put such a focus on the large and growing bilateral trade deficit with China, if that continues growing, it's only going to make solving this problem more difficult. And it's going to be on the administration's watch. At some point, they can't blame the previous administrations.
We've seen this.
You're good.
We've seen this kind of unilateral posturing where the president took a position on NATO. So is this maybe more about posturing than it is real policy?
Well, depends on what the this is that you're referring to. The whole trip, in a way, yeah. It would actually, I like the question. In thinking, what's the outcome supposed to be this week? What are we actually going to be able to accomplish, given all the misgivings Wendy and I have expressed about how this is setting up? Well, maybe the message is the medium, and the medium is a plane full of senior officials going to Beijing to have hard conversations. Maybe that's signifying both to the Chinese side, to the American electorate, and to some of our allies that we're going to check these boxes. We're going to go through these motions, and it's the checklist to May 22nd, imposition of $50 billion at least of tariffs.
Is it more about posturing and the image?
Look, I mean, in any of these negotiations, there's always posturing, and in this administration, they seem to really like to kind of up the ante and threaten sanctions and then try and get results. It has worked in certain instances, and the question is, what are the long-term implications of that? And I think it's just too early to tell. But clearly, if you look at the pattern of kind of threatening some kind of punitive action, we're going to take this money away, we're going to hit you with tariffs, and then we're going to get you to the negotiating table, and then you're going to agree with what we want. That seems to kind of be one of their negotiating tactics. At what point do other governments just call their bluff and say, go ahead? And for me, what's going to be very interesting to watch is vis-a-vis steel with the European Union, because the administration has given the European Union now another month before it will impose the steel and aluminum tariffs. It said to the European Union, you need to agree to a quota on steel. The European Union has said, we will never agree to a quota on steel. And this is going to reach ahead with the European Union in the next few weeks.
There's posturing on the Chinese side as well. That press gaggle the Chinese did on the eve of our delegation getting there that your colleague was at, Shery. Chinese trotted out the now standard talking points. We will not concede any of this to Washington. We're not going to change our system. We're not going to fundamentally alter, our plans for reform, et cetera. However, just this year, President Xi himself has made big out-of-cycle commitments to open up important sectors of the country way ahead of the timetable that they had intended. So, you have, of course, leaders on all sides saying, never under pressure will I agree to have this kind of conversation. And in practice, we can start to identify all sorts of measures that people are playing with to try to get out of a train wreck.
And how you turn it around so it looks like it's coming from you, not because you're under pressure as well.
Of course.
Exactly.
Any more questions? Here, Dan.
Just in terms of broad strategy, you mentioned the extension given on steel. Wendy, to put you on the spot regarding another part of what was once your portfolio, noises on NAFTA were very, very negative from the administration for a while. You don't hear so much negativity now. Have they decided at least that they want just one war at a time?
They want one more
war at a time.
They should have thought of that before.
I mean, is there a sense that NAFTA's going to get patched up and that let's just get it done. We've made our point, and the main game is here.
It's interesting watching the NAFTA negotiations now, because the way I understand, Ambassador Lighthizer said there's about 2 more weeks if we're going to wrap this up. The idea being that if you want to use the current trade promotion authority by Congress and get it passed in this Congress, you need to basically notify the agreement to Congress in sometime this month. And so there is a real intensive negotiating cycle going on now trying to wrap these negotiations up. But you're absolutely correct that the tone on NAFTA is very different now. And frankly, there are a lot of positive statements in the press. We're almost 80% done on NAFTA. We're cracking one of the most difficult issues, the auto rule of origin issue. And so, yes, it seems like NAFTA is headed in the right direction. I think one of the key issues there, I think, how many fights can you have with how many countries, number one. But also a lot of this, I think, has to do with politics in the upcoming midterm elections. Including where the U.S. agricultural community stands. Because if there's no NAFTA and they lose those markets at the same time that they may find themselves in the crosshairs of a U.S. China trade war, they will vote. And they will vote in the states that delivered President Trump to his office just a year and a half ago.
And if I may ask a follow-up, what's up with the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Will they rejoin? Will we not rejoin? You worked so hard on that. Any moment in time that gave you some real hope?
Yeah, but whenever that day happened, the next day took away the hope. Look, my sense is the fact that the president's even saying anything positive about the TPP is a good day. And I think what it shows that in many of these briefings now, the value of the TPP is becoming more and more apparent, if not to the president, to a number of the people around him. And particularly when you look at some of the issues we're dealing with in China, not that the TPP was about taking on China, it was about updating those rules that countries would follow in areas like state-owned enterprises, digital trade, et cetera, kind of the new issues of the future. So I remain hopeful that the administration will find a way back to TPP. What I would also, though, caution is that while other countries at one level now are saying they want us back in the TPP, some are saying not at any cost. Because remember, the other TPP countries now have concluded the deal without us. They are now working hard to put that into effect, and it's scheduled to go into effect probably the first quarter of next year. And the idea of the United States coming back in and wanting significant changes, I think, raises some eyebrows among the TPP 11 countries, some of our closest friends in the region.
Other questions? And I remember at the time of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because I was living in Japan, and how much political capital Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had to use to get Japan into the deal was a big issue. And Dan, how would that have played into, I know that Wendy says it wasn't about China, but it sort of was when it comes to the political influence that the U.S. would have had in the region.
Well, it's not about China in the sense that it's a conversation that would be happening even if there weren't a China in the international economy. The more advanced economies and the ones that want to more quickly ratchet up their regimes like Vietnam to get there quicker are willing to go faster than the overall membership of the WTO, which, as Wendy pointed out, hasn't been able to even get its pajamas off for about a decade now or more. And so if it didn't exist, it would have to be created, and it does need to be created. There are things happening in the world economy today, the presence of state-related, state-influenced firms as major competitors plunk down in the middle of the most market-oriented economies in the world, right? And not all of them are state. Some of them are private Chinese firms, for example, and from other countries, too, that are perceived to have so much support from state financing entities that the definitions that we thought about 15, 17 years ago when we were negotiating WTO accession for China, PNTR anyway, are really antiquated now. They were the right definitions at the time. They were state of the art, but that was a while back. So this is a conversation we need to be having. And there's lots more elements that aren't even in it that we're going to have to talk about. Competition policy, the Broadcom-Qualcomm case, and now the Qualcomm-NXP deal that's gotten gummed up, not to open a whole nother can of worms here, isn't even really covered by TPP adequately. The interaction of national security and even seemingly benign technologies like social media, not seeming so benign these days, TPP is not there yet in its ability to give us all comfort that we can stay global without having to block off and box out huge players in the world economy like China. So we've got a lot more work to do. TPP was a great place to get some of it done.
On that note, a lot more work to do, a lot more conversations to be had. On that note, I will end the panel here. Let's give it up for our panelists, Wendy Cutler and Dan Rosen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.